So, I think it won't take so much time. I'll focus on one particular problem concerning much more the use of the documentary material in a particular war situation. This particular war situation is, of course, the war in Bosnia, and later, or we call it, the war of former Yugoslavia, Yugoslav-Bosnian war. Nobody knows. There is no still final definition of those chain of wars from 91 till 99, and hopefully it has ended already. Probably some of you remember that a few weeks ago, Noam Chomsky, the famous American linguistic professor, has won an international poll organized by a magazine Prospect, that names him as the best, the most important, or the top world intellectual, public intellectual. The second one was Umberto Eco. But this was on this occasion, the Guardian made an interview with Chomsky, and this interview became these days has become a scandal, and these days everybody is discussing actually these words by Chomsky. What was the problem in the interview? In the interview, he repeated again his support for a journalist, Diana Johnson. This journalist, Diana Johnson, she wrote 3 or 4 years ago in Sweden an article about Srebrenica massacre, criticizing the official number of the victims. Of course, she says simply that this number was exaggerated. And the result of this article was an outcry everywhere in the public, not only in Sweden, so that even her publisher had to withdraw her book from the market. And at that time, Noam Chomsky was one who signed a letter of support for Diana Washington. But it was not only, and now he stresses again, that this was right what he did at that time. But this was not the only one controversy. The other one controversy he has mentioned in the interview was the case of a conflict between the British TV company ITN and the magazine Living Marxism. More than 10 years ago, the magazine Living Marxism accused the ITN of faking pictures of Serb-run concentration camps in Bosnia. And the reaction of ITN was very radical. They sued the magazine, and the ITN, the company, won the case on the court. And again, Chomsky stressed the right or his support for the magazine Living Marxism. He believes that both cases are example of, as he states, hysterical fanaticism about Bosnia in Western culture, something he describes as a passionate religious conviction. He also compared this situation with the old-fashioned Stalinism. If you depart a couple of millimeters from the official party line, of course you become a traitor and you have to be destroyed and so on. So this is the reason why he actually supports this, the journalist Diana Johnson and the magazine Living Marxism. For Chomsky, what is at stake in both cases is not the question whether they told lie or true. I quote Chomsky, It had nothing to do with whether Living Marxism or Diana Johnson were right or wrong. It is a question of freedom of speech, and if they were wrong, sure, but don't just scream, well, if you say you are in favor of that, you are in favor of putting Jews in gas chambers. Of course, the result of the public again was an outcry, and Chomsky is now accused of supporting genocide in Srebrenica, in Bosnia, or at least not being capable, to tell the truth from lies. I'm not telling this story to take sides or to invite you to take side between the Guardian and Chomsky, between the ITN and between the Living Marxism, between Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Muslims and so on. The reason is different. I believe that this example can help us to understand the nature, the status, the meaning, or what is probably the most important, the use of a document in a war situation. There is something very important in what Chomsky tries to tell us about the media representations of the war. He says that the question whether they, in representing the war reality, whether they are right or wrong is in any case irrelevant. This means that what decides the importance of a documentary material in war situation, what decides its meaning, it's not simply, doesn't depend on whether this document tells us truth or lie, which means that actually it doesn't depend on its referentiality. And this is the most important of what Chomsky says. But let me first analyze the case. The first case, I hope that something will come. Yes. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. This is this picture. This picture was broadcast 92 around the world. And you see there are few men, starved creatures behind, as seems, at least it seems so, behind the barbed wire. The guy in the front of the picture, he's only skin and bones. This guy, there is an anecdote about the guy. He escaped this camp and Bosnia, came as a refugee to Denmark, and meeting journalists, they wanted to make interviews with him, and meeting journalists, they had, he got always a problem, he got weight. He got 30 kilos more, so they were always disappointed, seeing him, because he was not a, living document as on the picture, because simply he got 30 kilos more. So this picture was taken by the ITN team in a camp in Trnopolje. This was not a concentration camp. Now we know that. It was some kind of detention camp, or how we call it, it is not different. But there is a problem with this picture. Actually, and this is what was the reason why the Living Marxism magazine accused ITN of faking this picture. These men are not actually behind the barbed wire, but in front of it. In this place, in this area, there is only one place that was actually wired around the trafo station. And the team, TV team, was actually within this space and they were outside. So that the picture was taken actually from within the barbed wire. And this is why the living Marxism insisted that this picture was actually faked. However, this photography is tricky because it doesn't actually show what it seems to show, namely a concentration camp. There were indeed concentration camps in Bosnia, quite a terrible one, but obviously this was not the case here. Later it turned out that the team, before they came to Trnopolje, to this place, they were in a real concentration camp in the West Bosnia, in Omarska. The real one, which means that we could find there all the atrocities we usually believe happen in a typical concentration camp. And they shot also pictures there, but the chiefs in the London office were not satisfied with these pictures. And allegedly the team was told not to come home without a picture of a Serbian concentration camp. So they went to Trnopolje, which was not a concentration camp, and they made this picture, which then became probably the most important picture document of the Bosnian War, because this picture triggered not only, you know, the waves of protest all around the world, but what is more important, it triggered the intervention, the involvement, which finally 3-4 years, 95, ended the war in Bosnia. This is why this is so important. One could say, well, it is fake, it was fake, but well, it worked very well as an authentic document. The problem was also that in the news, ITN didn't tell that this is a picture of a concentration camp. And this is why they could easily won the case in the court. Because nobody tells, you know, that this is a concentration camp. This is not what they claimed. The troop of the concentration camp was immediately deployed by the international media. This was a kind of a trigger. And after that, you saw the next picture. Yes, it is already. Thank you. This is the front page of Daily Mail, the proof. You see behind the barbed wire, the brutal truth about the suffering in Bosnia. Of course, what is behind the proof? Not the truth of the reality, but, of course, an analogy. Analogy which was explicitly emphasized in the next. It is Daily Star, war camp hell stuns the world, and you have on the left side Trnopolje, picture from Trnopolje, and on the right side Bergen-Belsen from the end of the Second World War. The trope of the concentration camp was also used later, in 1999, during the Kosovo War. Already at the very beginning of the war, and at the end of March, German Ministry of Defense, Rudolf Scharping, started to tell the stories about concentration camps in Pristina. And really, only a few days later, the German tabloid Bild Zeitung publishes this front page. They are driving them into concentrations. It drives in his KZ. They are driving them into the concentration camp. This is actually also not the truth, because those people was driven by force, but not into the concentration camp, but towards the Macedonian border. They are not going to the concentration camp, and there was not concentration camps actually at that time in Kosovo. But it doesn't matter. It was functioning all the time very well. What does tell us this story about the meaning of documentary material in the war? First, that there is no documentary evidence without interpretation, immediate interpretation of this material, and that this interpretation is always a sort of identification, or better, of subjectification, which takes place when we, for instance, recognize a photographic picture as a document. More precisely, what decides whether this photography would become a document or not is not primarily its relations to the material reality. That is, it's not how much truth it reveals about the reality, but rather what it makes of us. As I already told, what sort of identification it triggers. How does it influence not only our perception of this reality, but, and this is the most important, our reaction of this to this reality in terms of our passivity or activity. I told the first picture was a trigger for the very concrete military involvement of the West in the Bosnian War. In short, what makes a document is its capability to make of us subjects who also are capable of transforming the given reality. And this is precisely what happened with the picture from Trnopolje. It was used actually as a pretext for an action. The second moment is that this identification or subjectifications follows the pattern of the existing, or I could also say hegemonic political normativity, which means simply that it is always a kind of stereotype. The ITN team was sent to Bosnia to find the evidence of the war atrocities, of the unbearable human suffering, but not in the form of an objective truth, but rather in a form of a quotation from the past, from our common political past, something we could recognize. So they were searching not for an evidence of what happens there in Bosnia, but of what happens again in Bosnia. In short, their role was not to bear witness to what they saw there, that is, to repeat the truth of the reality as a medium that represents something. Not to repeat the truth of the reality, but on the contrary, to find out, or if you like, to produce the truth of the repeat, of the repetition. Of the repetition of what once already happened, we know, in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The problem was not, from the very beginning, and this is in this situation in which this documentary material emerges, the problem was not obscurity. It was not, the case that we didn't know actually what happens. Everybody knew before this picture that there are so many, that there is the reality of ethnical cleansing, and that the most important means to achieve the goals of ethnical cleansing are a sort of concentration camps. But there are all sides, not on the same level, but Bosnian Serbs first, then Bosnian Croats, had organized sorts of concentration camps. But the problem was that this kind of evil at that time was, a common evil. Nobody could tell at that time or differentiate the evil from the good. It was very abstract. People suffer in Bosnia. But with this one picture, the picture from Trnopolje, suddenly everybody could recognize what is the evil, what is the real, the ultimate evil, and what is the good, and what the difference between the perpetrators and the victims. But what is the most interesting, that we know that the ITNT, they faced this truth, this reality in its total transparency already in the Omarska camp. But the truth was not enough. They needed a quotation from the past to tell this truth. And this was the result, was then this big picture. The reason is very simple. It is the fact that their audience, the public of the developed Western democracies, could at that time imagine the evil only as something coming from the past, which also means only as something they or we already have defeated once and for all, and which is now returning from the past in some other spaces, or which is simply a leftover. And this is a typical for the 90s, for the wars in the former Yugoslavia, that they were understood as a kind of repeating of something what already happened before, and they were some kind of remnants of the old ideologies of fascism or communism or something. This is a typical post-89 situation. We can call it post-communism, post-Cold War situation. It is, everything is post, it's not only post-modern, it is the war is a post-war. The truth of the war is a kind that it is something we already had in our past. That the reality of the war, the truth of this war comes from the past. And this is the reason why they needed a quotation and not the truth. And what makes a document is a quotation, and not a quotation from the past, and not the reality. The possibility that the evil could be a part of their or our democratic actual reality, or even that the evil could come from the future, this was not imaginable in the 90s. I think today it's different, or I would say after September 11, it is different, but I'm not analyzing it, but I think that the trope of the concentration camp was the common trope of the wars of the 90s, of the post-89, post-Cold War wars. And this is also the reason why the answer to the challenge of the Bosnian or Yugoslav war, which means the political and later military intervention of the so-called international community, has finally failed. Well, I'm saying it really openly, it has failed, which means that the subjects of the horror on the ground, be it like, Croatian nationalists with Tudjman, or Serbian nationalists, or even Muslim Bosnian nationalists, they all have achieved their goals. As you probably know, the Dayton Agreement fixed simply these achievements. It has recognized and nowadays we celebrate 10 years of the Dayton Agreement, and the reality on the ground is that the ethnical cleansing has been realized everywhere in Bosnia, and now we have the situation where even within the same language in some cities there is a clear, radical segregation in the school between Muslim and Croat children, although they speak same language. This is the reality, which means that this kind of retro metaphor which was used is also part of the political failure of the whole situation, the whole war case in the Balkans. But you know, okay, I don't need pictures anymore. But it's very interesting that even Noam Chomsky, who emphasizes how important it is not to focus on the question whether a document tells us a truth or a lie, that even he, in explaining why this is not important, explaining why he was involved supporting those journalists or living Marxists, although they were wrong, probably, risking to be accused for supporting genocide, that even he believes that the problem lies in, in old-fashioned Stalinism. Even he believes that this is something, the problem, and telling the story about, freedom of speech, as though today, not only in the question of documentary material, but also, in the role of the media in concrete political situation in today's democracies, also believing that the freedom of speech is still the great value you should fight for, and so on and so on. The problem was in the 90s, and this was also my own experience, that the freedom of speech was not the problem at all. You could say everything, and you could talk about any possible alternative publicly, even during the war, because I was in Zagreb and writing for an anti-war magazine, anti-war movement, and so on. We could tell everything, but there was no alternative in changing things. There was no alternative in making the reality different. And this is also later. This was the fate of the military intervention, which hasn't changed the reality on the ground, but simply recognized what already has been achieved by the subjects of the evil from the past. So Noam Chomsky falls into the same trap, believing that the evil comes from something we already experienced in the guise, of Stalinist dogmatism, totalitarianism, and so on, and that the cure is a very old idea about freedom of speech, and so on and so on. So he too follows the same pattern of a repeated evil. But there is another possibility, to understand the war in the 90s in former Yugoslavia. George Agamben, for instance, offers us in Homo Saka a different perspective on what has happened not only in former Yugoslavia, but also in the whole space of the Eastern Europe. This is the so-called fall of the communism and communist totalitarianism and so on. The whole dissolution of the traditional state organisms in Eastern Europe, as he emphasizes. According to Agamben, we shouldn't understand these events as a return to the so-called natural state of bellum omnia contra omnes. These events were not, as so many today believe, a kind of foreplay, you know, for a new social contract, for a new democracies to come, and so on, for the establishment of new national states that should, in an evolutionary way, democratically and peacefully grow together into a larger democratic unity called European Union, and so on, and so on, and so on. On the contrary, he suggests that we should see in these events an appearance of the state of emergency as a permanent structure of juridical political dislocation. What we have to deal here in the case of these wars, Yugoslav wars, to deal with is not a regression of a political organization into some previous form, but rather, I quote, alarming events which as a kind of bloody messengers announce a new nomos on earth that treat to spread all over the planet. Very simple. These documents we have, documents of this war, are not only simply quotations. They explain this war in a way that this was simply a repeating of something, what already happened before. But if we change this perspective, as Agamben suggests, my question is, what is then? What should we then recognize as a document of this war, if there is no quotation? For you cannot, you cannot repeat something which is new, something which is coming to you from the future. And or the only thing you can do is to recognize documents as a symptoms which tells you how the illness will come from the future. In this perspective, it is the future development that decides the truth of the war reality, and simultaneously, which decides which of its representations would achieve the status of its authentic document. So, what tells us the real truth about the war is not simply its document, however authentic it could be. It's not a material which has but rather a material which has a sort of documentary potential, but whose documentary status is not yet decided by the reality itself. It is something I could, in a sort of paraphrasis, called a document to come, is probably something which would tell us the truth of the war. So, what I want to tell is that what we need is a kind of refocusing our attention in dealing with the documents from the past to the future, and to think about it, how documents emerge from the future, or how they are emerge as a part of our actual reality. It is, but I think, and I told already that the overall postism is over, and that in its practical, political, military applications, it has failed, and that now there is a new situation. But what of this pile of material would become the document of the future? I mean, the document of our reality, but that could be understood from the future perspective. This is what is still open. And what I believe is that this kind of recognizing of this kind of document is possible not simply as sort of reflection, but always as a sort of direct, practical involvement in only the reality we deal with. We try to change. Only this kind of reality will answer with the documents. And that's all for today. So.